Welcome to those of you who are on the webinar. We have quite an extraordinary crowd. I'm not surprised given the absolute importance of this evening's topic, the future of UK foreign economic policy. And of course, we're here to talk about the vital work of the LSE Economic Diplomacy Commission. I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the US and Americas program here at Chatham House, and I'm Dean of our Academy. I'm also a commissioner, although I should say not one of the most important ones. And I'm here really to chair this and moderate this conversation that's being held between the those who have really made this idea and come up with this idea and transformed it into a very, very important reality. We have with us Professor Linda Yu, Professor Mick Cox, and Creon Butler. Let me just say a word about each of them and a word about the Economic Diplomacy Commission and the importance of this project before I turn it immediately over to them to really tell us about the work, about the topic, and about what we can expect to hear from the Commission, perhaps, in the weeks and months ahead. Linda is chair of the LSE Economic Diplomacy Commission. She is very well known to all of us for her writings. Her most recent book, The Great Economists, is, if you haven't read it, you must read it. She is also a visiting professor at LSE IDEAS, and very well known to all of us for her very astute commentary on economic affairs and the most important issues in the global economy on the BBC and many other broadcast networks. Professor Mick Cox, of course, is mostly well known to us for his intellectual and scholarly contributions to the understanding of US foreign policy and international relations, Britain's role in the world. He is director of LSE IDEAS. He is professor emeritus at the LSE. He is the leading light of Chatham House in the sense that he was one of the early leaders of the US and Americas program, has a very long and important history on the program and continues on as an associate fellow. Creon Butler is the director of our Global Economy and Finance program here at Chatham House. He is also research director of our Trade, Investment, and New Governance Models, obviously one of our most important initiatives at Chatham House. Creon, who I consider a very dear colleague, one of our best thinkers, joined us from the Cabinet Office. He was most recently the Director of International Economic Affairs and the National Security Secretariat. Clearly, we have three very distinguished speakers to talk to you, not only about the Commission itself, but also about the ideas that underscore it, the key topics. What can we expect of Britain domestically in this current moment? Remember that the Economic Diplomacy Commission was begun before the pandemic and before the economic crisis that has come as a result of that. So like so many of the things that we're doing, it's been transformed by it. It's also a very important day today. We've heard the announcement of a new government office, the merging DFID with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Merging might be not the term that some people feel is most appropriate to decide to understand this announcement, but it's clearly very significant for the work of the Commission. So Linda, let me turn it over to you first to perhaps tell us what the Commission is, what the most important issues are as you see, and perhaps if you could also tell us what it is that surprised you most during the various sessions that have been held across the UK. What is unfolded that you hadn't expected to unfold, apart, of course, from the pandemic and all that has brought?
Lovely. Thank you very much, Leslie. And just let me add my thanks to you for chairing the session. Couldn't think of a better moderator. And also, of course, you're a commissioner. And in fact, both Mick and I are associate fellows here. And I'm very delighted that we can do this joint event. And you and Creon lead terrific programs at Chatham House. And so I think this is going to be a fantastically interesting discussion. I think that on any topic, but particularly with this panel on this topic, I think it's extremely timely. And let me just kind of maybe rattle through what is the Commission, a bit about our work, and as I said, I'll address some of the questions that's come out through the evidence session. So I think this Commission, the LSE Economic Diplomacy Commission, is really an initiative of LSE IDEAS. So the the Foreign Policy Research Center and think tank founded and led by Nick. So he and I started talking about it probably a couple of years ago now, to really think about how do you position Britain in a 21st century global economy. So in other words, what kind of trade and investment policies would best suit the 21st century? What would be the UK's global role? And then, of course, there have been lots of events that have influenced it in the interim, Brexit, the pandemic. But I think the underlying questions remain some of the most important ones, which is, and I really think of these questions in probably threefold. So the very first thing is, what does the 21st century global economy look like? And how should a country set its foreign economic policies, broadly defined? So not just trade and investment, but when I say global role, I also mean global norms, global rules, all of the things that really is about strategic positioning. And I think a second question that comes from that, and this is a question I think that with today's news and increasingly everyone is beginning to think about, is how do you make a commercially open countries policies around trade, investment, as I say, kind of global policies, international policies writ large, consistent with the values and the aims of non-economic policy. So for instance, making it consistent with environmental policies, foreign policies, developmental policies, national security, defense, intelligence policies. So I think it's that sort of refining of what the international positioning of a country should be. And I think the third part of the commission, I mean, there's obviously a lot more prawns, but I think the third part that's really just important to stress is that all economic policy is domestic. So whether you're talking about any of these things, you have to look, and the commission does look at, what the impact of that is across the UK, across the nations, across sectors, across regions, because distributional impact is so important, and that we need to make sure that that is always front and center. So, so with that, perhaps I could just summarize the midpoint and then hand over back to you. So we are literally at the midpoint of the Commission's work. We've had 5 evidence sessions across the UK before the pandemic moved us online. So we have 3 sessions to open the Commission's work. And then we've had 2 more sessions. So we've got another 5 sessions, and we're aiming to finish the report in early 2021. And it covers, as I say, these issues and actually many more. And so today's event really marks the midpoint. And to us, it's an opportunity to gain your expert views, the expert views of the participants, the invited attendees, to help us refine the work of the Commission, of our thinking, and to craft some concrete recommendations for how the UK can best position itself and its international structure and global policies to be consistent with its long-term goals, economic and non-economic. So I'm just going to quickly summarize where I think the first kind of half has taken us. And Leslie, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about the most interesting thing you mentioned that I've seen on this journey. So I would probably say, and these are just sort of my kind of selective points. And I should say that the interim report's already published on the Commission website at LSE IDEAS. If you just Google LSE IDEAS, you can actually read these reports in full. So I'm not going to do it justice. But I think in the first sessions, we really, I think, picked up the importance of distribution. So we need to look at, should all international policy, whether it's trade or investment or taking a global role, have a distributional analysis behind the legislation. So in other words, who does it affect and how much? And I mean sectors as well as people. And if you want to think about a more holistic approach to economic diplomacy, you need to have some type of international structure that does that. So does that mean a central department, which becomes more of a coordinating body? And we looked at, for instance, some potential models there. The US, for instance, has CFIUS. That's, may not be the model, but, some type of body, and then some type of parliamentary oversight on economic diplomacy, because it does touch all of these different policy areas. I think a second sort of strand is taking a leadership role on services trade liberalization, and doing that by embedding consultation, for instance, with stakeholders, whether that's businesses, trade unions, consumer groups. So in other words, just making sure that if you do take a leadership role, it's done with the widest possible consultation, because these days, no agreement, whether it's trade or investment, it's just about tariffs and rules. It's about much more. It's about standards, environmental standards, labor standards. It's about standards. And I think all of that is important to bear in mind. And then finally, what I said was one of kind of the big questions, and very timely for today, is aligning economic policies with foreign and other aims. So I think one of our preliminary discussions is around aligning these goals, but maybe don't align them too closely for development. So there are a lot of nuances here to think about. I think I'm just going to pause there and just say what I've found most surprising is the degree to which people may think, oh, what is economic diplomacy? How does it affect me? But actually, once you start talking about the issues, it does affect, many sectors, many different areas, because ultimately, especially in an open economy like Britain, these policies, you make a decision and it has a wider implication. So I think that part has been, good to see. And I guess the most surprising thing is what we started off with, which is defining economic diplomacy, which I think in of itself is an interesting intellectual question. Let me pause there.
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because when you began your work, there was one debate, say on, the big question of Britain's relationship with China, technology, and specifically on Huawei. And a number of the issues that you've looked at have moved, right? Britain's position has moved during the course of your evidence session. So presumably as you've gone around the country, whether, on trains or with Zoom, you're sort of playing with a moving target, because the context and the policy and the issues are rapidly developing. So, I mean, I'm quite keen as we move to Mick. We'll come back to you, Linda, obviously. But Mick, as we come to you, what surprised you? What is your, what were the big issues that emerged that you didn't expect to emerge? Or, was there a lot of consensus? Or did you find deep disagreement and contestation? And to the extent that you saw a lot of disagreement, how much of it was predictable? Did people line up where you imagined they would line up? Or did you go off to Wales and Scotland and across the UK and find that this was a regional differences? Was it partisan different? What were the dividing lines? Or maybe everybody in the UK agrees.
Well, I mean, a number of things haven't surprised me, but one thing that I think has come through loud and clear, and there's been many things, and I'm only going to simplify. As you know, Leslie, I've lived in all four parts of the kingdom, as they say, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And when we went to Scotland and when we went to Wales in particular, it was quite clear that some of the perspectives there about not just Brexit, but a whole bunch of things were rather different to what we found in London. And I think being sensitive to those issues of, you can call them regional variation, maybe you prefer to call it national variation within the United Kingdom. That's one thing that did come out quite strongly to me when we went down to Cardiff. Very interesting, but we were hearing things we were not necessarily hearing in London from the centre, and equally in Scotland. Their worries and their concerns were very, very great indeed, particularly about a no-deal Brexit, which they feel would affect them very, very badly. And I think that also brings up another thing, which I know Creon will talk about, namely how there is no such thing as foreign economic policy, because in a sense, everything that's foreign is also domestic. And I think Creon's going to pick that one up. What you do domestically has an enormous impact on you externally, and what you do externally is going to have a huge impact on what goes on within the UK. And it's building that domestic consensus, whether across the four nations or indeed across the peoples of Britain, north, south, east and west, I think is going to be very, very difficult. What I was going to say, just by way of generalizing a little bit beyond the Commission, a little bit, if you don't mind me doing that, just Leslie, very, very quickly, is in the old days, you remember you said I did US foreign policy, which I still could try to do today. It's increasingly difficult, I think. And in the old days, we used to work out we had two concepts, intentions and capabilities, if you remember. What's the intention of a country and what's the capabilities? And you always start with capabilities. And at one level, of course, you look at the UK from the point of view of capabilities, it isn't bad. You know, we've got great universities, the English language. London is situated in the right part of the world in the sense between Europe and the United States, Africa and the Middle East. We have the City of London. We're still the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. So on one level, the capabilities, it seems to me, do need to be stressed, and the strengths of the UK overall within the world, you know, are very, very real. And I always want to say that by way of optimism, because the next part is a little bit less optimistic, I think. Just need to keep that fundamental points in mind. But it seems to me what's come out to me doing this work, Leslie, not as an economist like Linda or Korean, but what's come out to me aren't just the capabilities, but are the huge challenges that the UK faces, not just because of ineptness or incompetence or bad choices, but simply because the world out there has become, it seems to me, much more difficult place to live in. And that's for 3 big reasons, as I would see it, and I'll be very brief on each of those. One, of course, is the thing we've been talking about within international relations, international economics, for a very long time, namely the shift of economic power, you know, towards the East, towards Asia, towards China, towards India, towards other parts of the world. Now, of course, that means bigger markets, more consumers, et cetera, more tourists, but it makes the whole world a lot more complicated. It makes the whole world a lot more complicated than the world we used to know, the G7 world of the 1970s or the 1980s. So there's an upside to a shift of power because it means it's a wider world economy with more consumers, more middle-class people consuming stuff. On the other hand, it makes the world altogether much more complicated, particularly when one of those actors in this shift of power clearly is China. And I think that is the crucial factor, as we've seen over the whole Huawei business. I think the second thing which has made the world much more complicated, much more challenging, of course, is simply Brexit. There's no point getting away from it. We set up this commission without thinking that Brexit was the central and only question. As Linda said, we set it up because we were looking at structural changes in the world economy and how they would feed into Britain and how Britain would relate to these larger structural changes. But we can't get away from the fact that Brexit has, in a sense, made those choices far more difficult, it seems to me. You don't have to be pro or anti. I think you can just stand back and say, look, this brings into play problems and difficulties and challenges you would never have had to deal with before. And the third great challenge that's come in, it's pretty self-evident because we're all sitting at home talking to each other across the digital divide, so to speak, is the pandemic. And again, the position of Britain, or indeed of any country in this pandemic, has been very great, except that the pandemic, let's be honest, has hit Britain very, very badly. You know, the numbers of deaths, we've seen all this, okay, the unemployment figures today were a little bit better, but nonetheless, it's hit all countries in the world very, very badly, particularly the United States. But I think it actually has it's had a particularly bad impact on Britain. And by the way, London has been such a central part of the success of Britain. And London was the great attractive draw. It was a great magnet. Now, because of the situation in London, and again, I don't want to talk it down because I'm a great Londoner, but nonetheless, I think we've got to see that this is also problematic because of what's been going on in London in terms of the pandemic itself. So I see Britain with huge capabilities, all sorts of possibilities, as we've discussed in the commission, but at the same time facing these three great challenges. I also end up finally with dilemmas, and you wouldn't expect me to end up with a straightforwardly positive note, would you really, Leslie, knowing me as you well do? The 3 great dilemmas are quite simple, flowing from that. One is, what do we do about Europe? Who do we choose? We're told that the world economy is going regional, but at the moment, the UK is beginning to leave one of the great regional trading blocs, which is the European Union. Secondly, our relationship to the United States. Everybody keeps talking about the special relationship as a security relationship. No, it's not. It's more than that. It's an economic relationship. It's a very powerful economic relationship in terms of investments and all sorts of other things. It goes back a very, very long way. But that relationship is more difficult now, not just because of the president in the White House, but because of all sorts of other things going on in the transatlantic relationship. And thirdly, and finally, and this again brings us up to the question of China. I remember a few years ago, and I'm sure you all do too, we were criticizing Mr. Cameron for kowtowing to China. I don't think anybody today is talking about that. In other words, we've seen a huge shift of opinion in this country amongst certain political elites and certainly in the Conservative Party about China, which again is another dilemma for us, because if we want Huawei, if we want 5G, We want all the things and the benefits of that relationship, which we may indeed have to choose. So I suppose what surprised me most, coming back to your original question, is how complex this all is. And maybe as an academic, I really shouldn't have been so surprised by that.
I am reminded in listening to you that I think we shared dinner the evening before the Brexit referendum and the evening before the 2016 US presidential election.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that you called both and I called neither, so perhaps my credibility is not high. I think the digital divide, Mick, is between all of us and those other people who actually can't come online, which
Exactly.
also raises a question about your rather rosy view of what London had become, which I think is not something that was necessarily shared, which again, I think comes back to the current moment, the inequality that we now know exists across a number of dimensions. The pandemic has highlighted that. I'm sure it's something that's been widely discussed across the meetings of the Commission, and something that I hope that we discuss more today. It's certainly a concern of ours at Chatham House. But before I say any more, Creon, let's hear from you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. I think the work of the Commission is fantastically important for the UK, and you know, has been set out by Linda and Mick. You know, these are some really complicated and difficult issues. I really wanted to make sort of four quick points, essentially. And first of all, I mean, essentially trying to address some of the questions that were set out in the invitation to this meeting, and one of them was really around the link between foreign economic diplomacy and what goes on domestically, both in our economy and our society. And I mean, the links, as Mick was saying, are really strong. So, for example, if you have, as part of your foreign economic diplomacy, a decision to say that you want border carbon adjustment mechanisms. So in your trade policy, you want to introduce variable tariffs that take account of the carbon content of goods that are imported into your economy. Clearly, you may do that because in the UK, we only account for 1% of global emissions. You may say that you want to push forward with very advanced work on low carbon adjustment, and you also want to influence other countries. But if you do that, there are some parts of the world where you will be able to have a strong trading agreement, not least the European Union, but there are other parts of the world, the US, certainly under the present administration, where that just wouldn't be possible. And you could say, you know, we're not going to be able to have a free trade agreement under those circumstances. And so that decision then very much impacts on you know, what is possible domestically. And you have to say to yourself, well, actually, is this the best way to achieve what I want? Because there may be other ways that you can achieve the same influence on the world without, for example, limiting your possibilities for trading with the US. And I think this goes to the point that it is a really complicated structure. And if you want to optimize these decisions, you have to have a really complicated and sophisticated analysis within government to say, well, which of these tools do we want to use? Now, if you look at it the other way, for example, that you might say, you know, we have a particular vision for our economy, as indeed Linda set out at the start, and that will influence your choices you make on your foreign economic diplomacy. So you might say for the UK, notwithstanding what's happened with COVID-19, that we really do want to double down on the UK being a global hub and on our role as an exporter of international services. And there might be very good reasons for doing that. You might say, you know, in the medium to longer term, you know, our sector is going to be just as important in the future. There's no particular reason why that should not have the attraction in the future as it has now. There might be a period of adjustment, but we will get back to that role. And similarly, you know, we may feel in the UK that we can combine the use of digital technology and our existing strengths in services extremely effectively. But if you're going to do that, you then have to say, well, a crucial part of being able to fulfill that role is to be really, really good at dealing with pandemics, because we know that pandemics are going to come in the future. And what we need to do is take from our current experience the best possible lessons that we can learn so that we are one of the most effective countries in dealing with it in the future, because that is what's essential to deal with, to have that strategy for our economy. And also, it's partly about what we do ourselves, but it's also about what we create globally, because if we want to limit the impact of pandemics on the UK, we need to have a very effective global system. And therefore, that will be one thing that we need to invest in terms of our foreign economic diplomacy. So, these choices work both ways. I think the third point I'd like to make is that, above all, I think we need to be realistic about the weight we have in the world. And this goes to Mick's point about the consequences of leaving the European Union. It gives us more flexibility, but as a trade negotiating country, we are very much smaller bloc than we would have been as part of the EU. And so we need to work out what that means for our strategy and to make some clear decisions. So very often, it may well be the case that we are most aligned with the EU going forward, particularly on policies that relate to climate change, maybe also in terms of policies that relate to human rights. Notwithstanding the fact that we're outside the EU, it may well be that that is the country with which we're most aligned. And we need to articulate our policies with that in mind. We need to find ways of influencing the EU, and being close to them will be one way of doing that. But I think it's unrealistic if we say, actually, we're going to, on all things, have a separate and independent approach. And I think the final thing I'd just like to say, really, is around the capabilities that we have. Now, to some extent, we have some very clear advantages already. So, our role in various international organizations, not least the IFIs, the G7, the G20, already gives us the influence to, the ability to influence the global agenda, and through that to deliver a number of our aims, whether it's the global architecture that we want to create, strengthen international rules, or whether it's an environment in which we can pursue the kind of bilateral discussions and agreements that we want. But we need to keep working on that, and we need to strengthen those capabilities. And I think one of the really important things to bear in mind is that the positions of principle we take on things like climate change, development, human rights, but also on things like belief in free trade are going to matter a great deal in terms of the influence we have in future. You can't, on the one hand, be a very effective negotiator on a particular topic, and yet on the other hand, be acting in a way that's inconsistent with that. So I think we need to think not only about our existing strengths, but how we develop those future strengths, and in particular the role of our positions of principle in terms of increasing our influence overall. I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Terrific interventions. Thank you very much for that, Creon. I'm going to ask one of the questions that has come from the Q&A. In fact, two people have asked this, but before I do, let me ask all of you, 114 people in the audience, we would love to hear some of your voices. So please write in just your name into the Q&A so that I can call on you. And when I do call on you, if you could unmute yourself. But first, while you're writing your name into the Q&A, I will ask the question, which won't surprise you, but there are a couple of angles on it. And it is this question about the announcement today that so many of us understood may well be coming, but nonetheless, perhaps were gripped by the conversation. This afternoon, Hitoshi Tojima says, this afternoon, Prime Minister Johnson announced plans to merge the DFID and the Foreign Office to create a new department. There were a lot of debates over this issue recently between the government and the parliament. How feasible is this? And what is your opinion? And we also have another question on the same question, which I think really speaks to one of the issues that I noticed as I was reading through the different evidence sessions from the Commission. And it is, does today's DFID decision, this is David Walker, thank you, David. Does today's DFID decision risk further fragmenting the Western countries' response to emerging market support and development, and inadvertently hand China a stronger global role? I think that speaks to one of the debates about BRI and whether or not there was an alternative form of cooperation that Western nations could come together to provide alternative financing for infrastructure. So what is your view? It's inevitable that the panelists will be asked this question. What is your view on today's announcement? And does it also play into China's hands inadvertently when it comes to the question of Britain's engagement with emerging markets. Who would like to take that one first?
Well, we're going to give this one to Creon to kick off, I think.
Ah, okay, Creon, go ahead.
Pass the buck.
Right. Okay. Well, I think. I mean, my key point. I think it all depends on the implementation. I mean, and that we'll have to see how that goes forward. So. And I may not have got as much detail as others have on the announcement that's been made, but I mean, I think the first thing to say would be that there's very clear legislation on how our development assistance should be used. And while that remains as it is now, you would expect that development assistance to be used in the same way, even with it being part of the same departmental organization as the Foreign Office. I mean, there clearly be scope for, potentially efficiencies in the way it's delivered, but also, increased flow of information between different parts of this new institution. But while the legislation is there and says this money should be used for poverty reduction and there should be a certain amount of it and so on, you won't see a change. Now, obviously, that legislation could change in the future, but as far as I'm aware, at least that's not part of the announcement as it stands today, but others may correct me. I think the other point I'm sorry, is that correct? Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. The other point I would make just very briefly is that I think the other issue that needs to be looked at is, quite how much aid we want to deliver and how we fix the amount of aid that we want to deliver. And the decision 10 years or so ago to choose 0.7%, I think made a lot of sense at the time. It was a clear target to aim for, and has been very successful in raising the level of UK aid. But as we've got to where we achieve that target, and as we go beyond it, you do get into a situation where, as we've seen this year, if our GDP falls, then our aid falls as well. So it can work both ways. Similarly, you can face a situation where, in order to try and fit as much as possible within the 0.7%, you find that there are kind of distortions in the way that funds are spent, because the desire is to use it for one purpose, but to cast it as being part of the 0.7%. So I think there are a number of practical problems that arise from having a 0.7% target, which is quite separate from how much effort you want to put into that. And I think that's an issue that's worth looking at as well. Thank you.
Professor Cox, let me ask you a question on this. Creon's first comment that it shouldn't really change where development priorities are and where spending goes, it doesn't really align with what we heard from the Prime Minister today, who made it very clear that this decision should really allow Britain to align its priorities, to amplify its influence, to really bring together its different ways of spending money and direct them. And if that's the case, you would expect to see changes. It's almost an indication that things haven't been in line, that there hasn't been a clear prioritization, that things haven't been aligned, they haven't been leveraged in the way that they could. So what do you make of this decision, and do you think it will lead to significant changes?
Well, I mean, I would be somewhat concerned, to be perfectly blunt about a merger between two very different kinds of institutions with kind of different ethos, different backgrounds, different expertise. And if you put one and one together, it sometimes can add up to two, but it can sometimes add up to less than two. And I would simply be worried, I must be honest, without seeing any of the details. So I'm really kind of flying by my pants here a bit, but to worry about that. And certainly people I know in DFID have never looked too enthusiastic in the first instance about this, thinking that they would lose their identity and indeed maybe part of their budget, because we always know what happens with the merger and acquisition in the business world. And I think, there's worry therefore that an M&A in this regard may have some really problematic consequences as well, but we will have to wait and see. Could I just pick up also quickly on the China point, because it was also raised. I don't think China's been following this very, very closely. Perhaps they are, but somehow I would doubt it. I mean, they're far more interested, as we well know, in the whole debate in this country about Huawei, about 5G, high technology. That is what really, really concerns more than what's been going on, I think, in terms of this particular merger going on between DFID and the Foreign Office. And the other thing, I'd also, whether it puts China in a stronger role or a weaker role, I don't think it really matters, to be perfectly honest. I think we're far too preoccupied by what we do is going to affect how China sees the world and how China's role in the world. You know, China's going to take its own view of what it's going to do. And although there's been a hugely, I think, exaggerated talk about, you know, the rise of China, I believe it's been exaggerated anyway. And, you know, even China ruling the world. You know, China, as many of us in ideas, and I think also in Chatham House would say, China's got huge domestic problems, and those domestic problems have increased dramatically as a result of this pandemic. Everybody keeps talking about China winning the COVID war. I just don't buy into that. I think they face huge difficulties of transition out of this. The economy is weak, and if the global economy is weak, China is in problems. I'm not underestimating Chinese influence, but I think we've got to be a bit wary of, you know, either exaggerating what this will mean for China. Yeah.
Linda.
Thanks, Leslie. I think I would probably just add that, you know, one of the interim conclusions we came to, and of course this is all, you know, we're only midway through, is to think about how you could begin to align, you know, goals better. So if, and of course this is sort of, you know, what Korean's already stressed, you know, if the goal is primarily poverty reduction, then unless the legislation around the structure of that decision really begins to challenge the primary goal, then going back to a pre-1997 structure, in a sense, is almost part of a bigger kind of government shakeup. And if you had an alignment and where areas you should not align are made clear, and every policy still has their main aim, by, you know, and again, I'm not an expert on bureaucracy. We are actually going to have our session on how to deliver economic diplomacy as a session. But, you know, I would have thought that one of the things you have to think very hard about is, you know, once you have some degree of, I mentioned at the beginning, a holistic approach to doing policy, you can make sure that policy is not inconsistent. Not every policy is going to further your aims. Not every policy should further your overall aims. But are your policies inconsistent? Do they undermine your position as a values-based, principle-based player in the world economy? And I think those are why, you know, this discussion is complicated. And I suppose, you know, just a quick word on potential other mergers. Business and trade, PAYS and DIT, that's one of the other rumored ones. So I guess what I'm saying is, you know, I think we may well see more of this. And if I may, I actually just want to say there's a number of commissioners who are actually participating in today's seminar. The commission is made up of academics, as well as leading practitioners in a range of different policy areas. And so I always feel that, you know, it's only by bringing together all these different approaches can you come up with something sensible in the end. And then, of course, you know, taking comments and challenge, and that's absolutely key, and why the reports are open for public comment, and why we're here. You know, Korean's already given lots of great ideas, and we'll be noting your 4 points. So, but Leslie, I feel, you know, you have considerable expertise yourself, and you know, I do hope, time permitting, you'll be able to share some of those, because obviously you've also had experience in USAID. So,
let me come to one of the questions. Let me come to a couple of the questions. Mike Gapes writes, is the divided political culture and current governmental institutional infrastructure of the UK capable of effectively meeting these diverse challenges, or will we have decades of fudge, delay, and indecision? Mike Gapes, former MP. And let me read out one more question while more people are putting their names in the box. Letitia Lean, what is the Liberal answer to the left behind regions? Is it possible to address these problems within the market? And sorry, one more. Richard Oblath is asking, how prominent was climate change in the input you received so far? And how concerned are you? Who would like to begin? Mick, I can see that you'd like to begin.
Well, I'll leave Mike Gapes' open question for somebody else to deal with about fudge and indecision. I'll only reveal my own political prejudices, Mike. But I mean, twere ever thus, I think, to be perfectly honest, the idea that anybody necessarily decision making at any level, indeed in any country, to think that it's anything other than fudge and indecision, and decisions that are finally taken are the ones that create the greatest degree of consensus rather than necessarily being always the correct and brilliant decisions that looked at being after the event. I don't know. But anyway, I'll leave Linda to deal with that very diplomatic question from Mike. Thanks, Mike, anyway. Great admirer of you, by the way. Is there a liberal answer to left behinds? No, that's a great question, actually. I think the left behinds, understanding that to mean those who have not benefited from globalization, those who have lost their jobs, those who are living in deindustrialized areas of the northeast of England and central Midlands, many of those who went over to the Conservative Party in the last general election, much to everybody's surprise, except maybe perhaps for Boris and Dominic Cummings. Is there a liberal answer? I don't think so. I think it's going to require a high degree of government intervention. I think it's going to require a high degree of state intervention. And indeed, one of the things that's also come out of the pandemic, which may not run easily and sit easily with the Conservative Party, is in fact, the pandemic has been handled by a massive degree of government and state intervention and underwriting of the economy. So one of the ironies of the situation we're in at the moment, that something which is about markets and market-driven decisions actually could lead us into a situation with a much greater degree and role of the state, whether to deal with the left behinds or whether to deal, as we are seeing at the moment, with this ongoing pandemic. And I'm not quite sure those regulations and controls and supports are going to go away very, very, very quickly. On climate change, very briefly, we are dealing with climate change. Robert Faulkner, one of our key commissioners, has been very involved in this, and we're going to take more evidence on this. Do we think it's important? Of course we think it's important. The question is, what is the relationship? And I'll leave this one open for other people to think about. What is the relationship between the current pandemic and the climate change debate? Has it made the climate change, has it pushed the climate change debate down the list, or will it accelerate it to the fore in the future?
Thanks very much. So I would like to kind of respond on the question of the sort of liberal economic model and so on. I mean, I think as we're going forward, we will need to, and I think this is a part of the kind of central tenets of the Commission, is to look very closely at both, if you like, the domestic measures that need to go alongside our international strategies. So, you know, when it comes to decisions on free trade, which mean that particular regions are going to either have a boom or will be under pressure, one needs to look very closely at what domestic strategies need to go alongside that. I guess one of the potential benefits of leaving the EU is that we will be able to optimize those policies much more clearly. Obviously, the exact nature of our eventual agreement with the EU is still to be determined, so how much extra flexibility we will get. But in principle, on both sides, we will have some more flexibility, both in terms of the international agreements that we sign and in terms of the domestic measures that we put alongside that. On the question of the role of the state, I think it's really important not to make the assumption that because there is rightly a very large state intervention at the present time, just because of the completely unprecedented nature of the COVID-19 crisis, that this necessarily will continue in the future. Because in a way, as the reasons for the intervention disappear, then there may well be legacy consequences if the government has had to intervene through purchase of stakes in various companies, but equally those, as we've seen with the financial crisis and the stakes that the government bought in the financial system, they can be wound down over time. So I think one needs to look very objectively at what, in the world that we're in, where you need state intervention on a continuing basis as compared with as part of the crisis response. And personally, I'm not convinced that that is going to be dramatically different from where we are now. I think quite a lot of what we want to achieve is going to come through regulation, and through strengthening and developing further our existing public health responses and the global cooperation that's so important in terms of developing new vaccines and so on. It's not clear to me that you will actually need a much bigger role of the state to deal with the world that we're in the future.
And I'm curious your reaction to that. That was that's a very big claim, and the truth will unfold over time. But what is your reaction to this?
I think I would probably just stress, I think one of the points that's been brought up very nicely by both Kriyan and Mick is that the reason you look at this holistically is because we've known for some time, for instance, that when you have adjustment effects from international trade, the solution is not entirely in trade policy. In fact, some economists would argue most of the solutions have to be felt in domestic, redistributive, or upskilling policies. So this is why you have to, and this is why, you know, when I said at the beginning, I view this Commission's work in really kind of 3 prongs. The third prong is hugely important. It's about the fact that all economic policy is domestic, and trade is a great example of that. So rather than, yes, of course, you would want to have better labor standards, environmental standards, something that we're going to pick up in this last interim report about how you do that, because there are spillovers between what you do domestically to what happens in terms of your external trade and investment position. But then conversely, the reverse is also the same. So, so I think I would probably just add, when you deal with the left behinds, when you think about the hollowing out of the middle class, all of these distributional reasons are why one of our interim reports suggests every time you have a trade or investment, foreign investment, or some agreement on global norms or rules, you do a distributional analysis, like what the Treasury does after the budget, or some budgets, where they will put in how it affects different households at different income levels or different regions and sectors. So I think that's probably something to stress. And I know, I think Susan, one of our commissioners, wants to come in, but I just wanted to sort of, I think her mic is now sorted, but I think there's just one more thing that I would want to stress, which is, we live in a very different policy era, and I think this is why this debate is so important. So, we also looked at how you reconcile some of these competing aims. Kriyan pointed out very, clearly. My guess is it's going to have to be some type of, it's never going to be a one type of policy. So on some things like supply chains, which I'm sure before the pandemic, very few people spent very much time looking at, except as economists who were looking at reshoring and other things, is now, is something which countries will look at with a policy angle. This is something we've discussed, a national security angle on it. Are there very important supply chains, whether it's in medicine or defense? What is the resilience of those supply chains? So you're taking a concept which in economic terms might just be, offshoring and production and global value chains, but you're actually now today having to view it in a more holistic way, and the pandemic has really, I think, brought that to the forefront. But that is one of the things I think we should expect going forward. And I think it's actually, it's a good thing to look at, step back, look at it holistically. And then I guess, finally, and I hope Susan might pick this up, is how do you deliver it? It's the structure, it's the execution. It's fine to have these, big policies, and we're going to be strategic about it. But what's the execution? What's the structure? How are you going to end up, doing this? So yeah, no easy answers.
Let me just read out a couple of questions. They're just great questions here. Of course, I would say this. Stephen Cooney, how does the bipolar outcome of the US presidential election affect the UK's perception of its role? Is it a prisoner of whoever wins in the United States? I hope that it's a bipolar outcome and not something in between. I have to editorialize there. And then we also have a great question here from Kieran Lubke. How strong will the priorities of the regions feature in the UK foreign economic policy? How will Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland make their divergent views heard in a system which tends to make decisions at the center? This has clearly been a really important question for you. And then from Nicholas Sigler, what would be the impact of UK foreign economic policy if the government fails to extend the EU exit transition period? So those are 3 rather large, rather fundamental questions that people talk about a lot. What does the Commission so far have to say about this? What light can we shed, or what are your own views on one or more of these topics? Kriyan, would you like to begin?
Yeah.
Mick, did you want to begin?
I was just going to jump in on what is called the regional question, which I prefer to call the national question, having lived out in the various nations of these islands. As I said in my opening comments, one thing that did surprise me, though maybe I shouldn't have been so surprised, was simply the different perspectives that came when we were in Cardiff and when we were in Scotland. But I also know quite a lot about Northern Ireland, given that I taught at Queen's University in Belfast, a fine university it is too, for over 20 years. And therefore I've kept very much in touch with what's been going on in Northern Ireland economically, and how Brexit overall, if that's the question, is going to also impact on this, or the more general consequences of current economic policies for Northern Ireland. Now, of course, I think this has created all sorts of difficulties. In the end, Boris Johnson, we know, had to kind of almost be like sell the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, down the line and draw the line actually down the Irish Sea and not across the border. I think it's created all sorts of problems. I think, however, interestingly, not talking about Scotland or Wales, but talking about Northern Ireland actually could be a little bit of a beneficiary of an outcome, because in a way it is going to maintain obviously a strong integrated relationship with the UK, whatever formalities are going to be erected. On the other hand, it still remains in some ways it's part of the single market. So it could actually be a beneficiary of that. But I think the dynamics, and I'm going to be outlandish on this one, by the way, and it might offend one or two unionists out there. I think the dynamics of where we're going in Ireland is actually over long term towards something which will look more like a united Ireland than a united kingdom. That's my long-term feeling about the dynamics of this, because I think the longer-term relationship between this part of the world, namely London and England and Northern Ireland, I think is going to erode. And I think what's going on with the Brexit vote is going to do that. On the US elections, I'll leave that to you, Leslie. I know who I want to.
I prefer to hear what you have to say.
Okay, very quickly. I thought until COVID, I thought Trump was a bit of a shoo-in, be perfectly honest, on the economy. I know you didn't agree with that. I think it is now much more open to where this election could go. But we all know this is going to be a dirty election. If Biden were to win, there's already indications that the current President Trump will not accept the legitimacy of it. He's already preparing for a post-November situation, which could get even worse than the lead up to it. What impact is it going to have on the UK, which I think was I think it's simply going to make it much more difficult. I think if I might be blunt, I don't give advice to governments very often, and not that they would ever listen, I think, but I would also say, beware, don't choose winners or losers in this, because in the end, the UK is going to have to deal with the United States of America. Whoever is in the White House. And that sounds terribly diplomatic for me, but that would be my advice. I'll leave the other question to other people.
Very, very diplomatic for you, Mick.
Yeah,
it was really.
Creon.
Yeah, thanks. If I could just sort of follow what Mick has been saying. So I mean, this is a kind of an objective assessment. I think one thing that will change if there were to be a Biden presidency is a different approach towards international cooperation more broadly. And given that that's an absolutely central part of UK foreign economic diplomacy, which is to maintain and strengthen international institutions and update international rules to make them more appropriate to the evolving nature of our economy and so on. I think that will be a situation which it will be easier for the UK to push forward what it is seeking to achieve, and particularly in fora like the G7, which the UK will be hosting next year, as well as in COP26. So I completely agree with Mick that one should prepare for every eventuality, but just as an objective statement, I think that that will make that aspect of it would be easier. I just wanted also just to pick up, because I feel really guilty. Someone asked earlier about the importance of climate change and how worried we were and how much evidence. And I mean, I just wanted to say, I think this is massively important. It's the next big existential threat. And in the policies we're developing to exit from COVID-19, we hope, and as we ease the lockdown measures, develop a new stimulus, we need to have policies which actually jointly target not just the exit from COVID, but also the low carbon transition and the factors that need to go along with that, because it's not that far off when we will be facing the kind of threats from climate change that we've experienced from COVID-19. So I just wanted to make that point in case people felt, it had been neglected. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Creon. And Linda, I think since we're coming up to the top of the hour, or the end of the hour, you get the final words on these three very significant questions, which is entirely appropriate given your role in the Commission.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And what a great discussion. I know we're out of time and we won't be able to do justice to them. So I think if I just may quickly pick up 2 points. I think one is, Brexit is a source of uncertainty. And I think we'll need to watch, and the Commission is watching over the next month, how that future relationship might pan out. So I think it obviously will have impact on how the UK can set its trade and investment policy going forward, because some countries will be looking to the UK-EU relationship. But I think the kind of, the overall point I suppose I want to conclude on is really that when we say what is an optimal set of policies, it is really about defining the world in a more environmentally green way, in a more sustainable way, in a more values-based way around democracy, effective rule of law. So basically all the kinds of things that should guide policies. And I think for economic diplomacy, it's about making all the different aspects of foreign policy, foreign economic policy, trade and investment, all of those things align. So if we want to be net zero by 2050, how do you achieve that? How do you do it through your trade and investment policies? How do you do that? For instance, the UK taking a global role by creating a new group in the UN, which is going to further COP26 just this month. Are there other initiatives that can be done, especially as the UK takes on the helm of the G7, because it's probably not a great time to be an economic superpower. It's a weird statement to say, but as you see with the head of the WTO, the US suggests somebody, China might object. If China suggests the new head, the US might object. So there is space for rules-based, values-based power, especially a power like the UK. And I think that's probably the final thought I wanted to leave on, is that we need to almost shed the 20th century structures that we've grown used to and think afresh about what the 21st century could look like. Probably more platforms, probably more voluntary networks, probably all of these things. But what we absolutely need to do is to balance commercial openness with alignment with our other strategic aims. And as we've been discussing tonight, maybe not too aligned on some things, but at least not inconsistent. And I think that's probably the final thing that I would stress. And also just to say thank you again for hosting this lovely session. We very much welcome comments. The interim reports on the Commission website are open for public comments, so please do give us your views, and we're at the midpoint. We've had lots of exciting discussions, and we will have, I'm sure, many more, but the more input we can get, the more challenge we can get, we can make sure we produce something concrete and hopefully useful for the UK's economic diplomacy.
I do think this is a tremendously important initiative. We're used to government commissions, we're used to think tank commissions, but there's something distinctly unique and very special about a public university and the LSE hosting this kind of commission and taking it on the road, which is not something that's always been done across the UK. I mean, there is no more important moment for it. It's become even more important during the course of the time. I'm glad to see it feels like the commissioners, or at least Creon, who's not a commissioner but is clearly very central to these debates, is more optimistic perhaps about us moving beyond the pandemic, I think. But these questions remain, and they are central, and I really do encourage everybody to follow Linda's advice to read and to offer insights and evidence. It's a tremendous opportunity, actually, to gather a broader range of expertise than we frequently have weighing in on these very important decisions. So thank you all. Thank you, Mick. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Creon. And thanks to all of you, and have a lovely evening and carry on the conversation, hopefully also at Chatham House.
Thanks again for the invitation to Chatham House.
Yep. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much. Brilliant session.
Linda.